Lee ignored this person's question. Instead, he looked around at the corpses of zombie Knoll that laid on the ground. He recalled that in the past the zombies the necromancer controlled resurrect after being defeated, so he was expecting the zombie Knolls to resurrect as well. But nothing happened, so with this and the way this person reacted when he mentioned the name necromancer made Lee come to the conclusion that he isn't the necromancer. But another question quickly arose: if this person wasn't the necromancer, then how is he connected to him? Lee turned to this person and he asked about his connection to the necromancer. This agitated this person. He called Lee a lunatic, and he expressed that it seems Lee doesn't understand the situation he is in. This person started releasing his immense pressure and he called Lee a rascal. Then in an instant, he closed the distance between him and Lee. He pulled back his spear, expressing that he will give Lee a painful death for ignoring his question. This person swung his spear downwards, putting immense power in the swing, and Lee crossed his arms, blocking the attack. This person was pissed. He believed that Lee was below him, so the fact that he was able to block his attack angered him. As they were still locked in the exchange, Lee glared up at this person. If his body strengthening skill hadn't absorbed the ability of the hero rank weapon Manon and Mackler's secret armor, then his arm would have been cut off for sure. It was time for him to lock in, otherwise his life would truly be in danger. He quickly moved away from this person using a skill combo. At the same time, he utilized this person's blind spot to attack from the back. As the combat knife drew closer, this person noticed. He hit the combat knife away, and he questioned if Lee really believed these petty tricks would work. Lee remained silent. He stopped himself suddenly, and he stood holding his arms out. This person was taken aback. He pondered why Lee was in that weird pose. He turned his attention to the ground, and he noticed that the shards of the divine beads that were scattered around were rattling in the ground. In that moment, Lee motioned his hands in a crossing motion, and instantly all the shards of divine beads levitated from the ground, and they headed for this person like a bunch of knives. However, in an instant the snake that was wrapped around this person instantly coiled itself around him, protecting him from the attack. Lee couldn't believe his eyes. He looked on with an agitated expression on his face. This person glared at Lee from the safety of the snake, wondering if this was really the attack pattern of a level 18 hunter. Lee quickly took an attack stance. The fact that this person stopped that attack now made it certain that he is way past the Red Gate's level restrictions. They both asked at the same time, questioning how the other was able to get inside this gate. This agitated this person further. His glare intensified, and he expressed that Lee is going to annoy him to the very end. As the snake was uncoiling itself, Lee noticed that the snake wasn't able to perfectly protect the vampire's body. The vampire's right arm had been sticking out when the claymore went off, and some of the shards was able to impale his arm, and now the shards of divine beads were burning the vampire's skin. Lee knows that there are only a few players who are harmed by divine power, and as Lee realized what this could spell, his agitated look swiftly shifted to a concerned one. There is a hunter-devouring group called Vampire. They're an evil tribe who annihilated the MT when they got information that the soul wave was coming. This person gritted his teeth and he praised Lee for his ability to piss people off. Then he swung his arm downwards, and all the shards fell off of him, and the injuries he sustained in his hand quickly started healing. Then he pointed his spear at Lee, and he started gathering energy for an attack. The vampire was certain that Lee had no plans of answering his questions, so he asked Lee if he would open his trap after he chopped off a limb or two. Lee realized that the energy around the spear belonged to the hero rank weapon, Spear of Achilles, that the Gudwang group was looking for. And if the spear's true powers are unlocked, even the fusion of secret armor and steel body skill would be rendered useless. If he doesn't dodge this next attack, it will spell the end for both him and his platoon members. With no other choice, Lee pulled back his sleeves, revealing the arrowhead of Failnaught. However, in that instant he received a warning message from the system. The message advised him to proceed with caution because he had less than 60% of the original time remaining on the potions he took. Lee glared at the message with an annoyed expression. He now has to come up with a plan to win within less than 2 minutes, otherwise he would die when the effects of the potion disappear. He took out the cloud blade, and he started thinking of his next move. As Lee was racking his brain for a plan, the vampire glared at him, expressing that he will force Lee's trap open, even if he has to rip it apart with this attack. In an instant he closed the distance, and he tried piercing Lee's head. Lee was able to dodge using a skill combo. However, in the instant he moved back, the vampire's spear released the dark energy it had gathered. Luckily, Lee was able to react in time. He leaned backwards, doing the reverse of the Michael Jackson. The beam from the Cloud blade left a path of devastation, and as this went on he sent the cloud blade from above, but the snake swiftly put itself in between the cloud blade and the vampire's head. This surprised Lee, and in his daze, the vampire pulled back his spear, and he reminded Lee that, as he stated earlier, his petty tricks wouldn't work on him. The vampire released more of the dark energy and he swung the spear sideways. Lee swiftly ducked, and luckily a piece of his armor that covered his shoulder was cut off instead of his head. Lee looked at his shoulder. He couldn't hit the vampire with the bead shards because the damn snake keeps defending against all of his long-distance attacks. On top of that, the spear of Achilles is making close-range combat next to impossible. The vampire continued his relentless attack. He thrusted his spear, releasing a beam of dark energy with every thrust. Lee used the skill combo to dodge the beams. The vampire chased after Lee, who was backing away while dodging the beams. As he charged, the vampire charged up another beam, and he expressed that Lee has no right to speak the Great One's name. He released the beam, and Lee used the skill combo to swiftly jump in the air, and in that process he left something behind. As he maneuvered himself to the ground, Lee glanced at the present he left behind, and with a grin he noted that even though it's earlier than he wanted, it's time for him to play his secret card. After getting on the ground, Lee glared at the vampire with a serious expression on his face. He stated that since the vampire was so obsessed about his identity, he will give it to him. He told him that he is a soldier of the AMT, and since they were finally communicating, Lee thought it would only be fair if the vampire answered some of his questions. So he asked if the vampires were discharged already. The vampire started releasing his immense pressure again, questioning what nonsense Lee was spouting. He expressed in an annoyed tone that he isn't here to talk, and he demanded that Lee shut up and just answer his questions. As he said this, the vampire quickly noticed the present that Lee had left behind. Lee watched the flustered vampire with a grin, and he expressed that the vampire was making it obvious that he never joined the military. The scene then shifts, and we see a horde of zombies following the trail of explosions that Junmo and the others were leaving. Junmo, who was hiding, observed the zombies as they charged past. He took out a grenade, and as he was about to pull the pin, TCO desperately grabbed his hand and begged him to stop this. He told Junmo that this is their chance to escape while the boss monster is nowhere to be seen. He eagerly added that even the Blue Flower Guild's raid squad wouldn't be able to make it with all those zombies, so there's no way Lee is alive right now. He expressed that the most important thing right now is to hide. Junmo glared at TCO, stating that their corporal, Lee, isn't a man who'd fail so easily. TCO continued to grip Junmo's hand tightly, and he questioned how they can all be so sure that Lee hasn't already died. And Junmo shouted that it's because they haven't received the signal yet. TCO looked on with a perplexed expression, wondering what signal they could be waiting for. Then in a flashback, we see that after Lee had called Junmo over, he whispered to him that before they leave this zone, he should stick a claymore mine to his back. Junmo whispered back, questioning if Lee was referring to the KM-18A1 that they brought. Lee expressed that he was, and he told Junmo of his plans to use the claymore as a signal to them that he has used his last resort. He glanced over at TCO, and he explained that when that happens, Junmo should make sure he and the others hide as best they can until another squad from the Blue Flower Guild enters the gate. Then he leaned closer, further lowering his voice, and he whispered something else to Junmo. At the scene of the battle, Lee used his metal control ability to pull the pin out of the claymore. The mine exploded in the face of the vampire, and it scattered beads filled with divine power. However, luckily for the vampire, the snake acted swiftly again, and it coiled around the vampire. But this time around, the explosion and the divine power beads were too much for the snake's defenses. It cried out in pain, and Lee swiftly hid behind a wall, and he braced himself to endure the shockwave of the blast. The Claymore, or KM-18A1, is a horizontal fragmentation directional shrapnel mine, a weapon of mass destruction with C4 explosive that fires over 700 metal beads, 1/8 inches in diameter and about 3 millimeters in length, and since they were going into a zombie gate, Lee had the metal bead inside the Claymore infused with divine power. A short while later, the dust from the explosion started to settle, revealing that the vampire was unarmed by the attack. However, the snake that had coiled around him fell to the ground. The vampire spoke, stating that he is one of the chosen, and he asked Lee if he really thought a bomb like that could kill someone who was chosen. Suddenly, Lee motioned his hands towards the vampire, and a bright light shone, and in that instant, the vampire was impaled with Failnaught. As he flew backwards from the force of the attack, the vampire pondered in pain, questioning how Lee's attack was able to move so fast that even he couldn't see it. The vampire was impaled to a tree by Failnaught, and Lee continued to hold him there. As the vampire tried to remove the arrow, Lee chuckled, and in a menacing tone he mocked the vampire, saying he is too simple-minded. He went on to explain that the claymore was to deal with that annoying snake, and that this arrow was his true trump card. The vampire gripped Failnaught tightly, and he poured all of his strength into removing the arrow. Lee watched the vampire struggle with a grin. He told the vampire that his efforts are useless, because he was holding the arrow in place with all of his power, so no matter what the vampire does, the arrow wouldn't be easily removed. Lee told the vampire not to worry, since he didn't plan on killing him immediately, and with his signature evil grin, he questioned if the vampire would allow him to ask his questions now. You made it to the end of the video. If you want to see more, then hit the like button. Also, while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe.